When does geopolitics become evil? War has been a factor throughout recorded human history. We cannot look askance at what is happening in the world today without having some qualms about the dramatic tales of conquest we grew up with as a child. Because in the past 20 years we've seen a dramatic shift, a complete inversion of the good guys narrative that characterized the West and allies in the Second World War. There has been something of a constant degradation of the mighty and honourable West, if such ever existed, since World War II. Korea was an unpleasant war, but without being a historian, it seems something of a classic Cold War, communism versus the free world conflict. Vietnam, regardless of its geopolitical intentions, was a costly and unpopular war. However, the real shift occurred at the end of the Cold War, 1990 plus, and the coincidental or not start of the first Gulf War. Previously, the USA had operated somewhat under the protect the free world mantra, but in the first Gulf War, that facade began to crack. I recall watching on CNN as an expert in a wonderful German accent said, "Come on, Senator, let's be honest, this is about oil." For myself, I realized I had no interest in seeing my friend, an RAF pilot, being killed for oil. It was in many ways the beginning of my separation from the narrative and automatic allegiance to our side. With 9/11 and the War of Terror, the same players now came front and centre to frame a fraudulent narrative for their own ends. The supremacy of the USA was now taken for granted by the likes of Dick Cheney, and one husband and wife have epitomised the new era of war at any price, backed by a fraudulent narrative that now verges on pure evil. Robert Kagan was a founder of Project for a New American Century, and how Pyrrhic that is turning out. A strategy to take down the enemies of a Middle Eastern ancestral homeland would be ideal, but couldn't be implemented absent a new Pearl Harbor. How fortuitous that a new Pearl Harbor happened in the first year of the Bush-Cheney administration. Regardless of your understanding of what happened on that day, let us point out the following. The 3,000 deaths on that day represented a 30% blip for one day in the entire American history. It was a bad day, but for 1/3 of one day's deaths, the USA should go on a 20-year war, a $4 trillion bonus for the military-industrial complex. And if you do take the time and trouble, then yes, there's plenty to examine that highlights the fraudulent nature of the narrative. Our contribution was 9/11 Pentagon Strike on Kindle, which provided clear, unequivocal demonstration of the fraud. In official evidence in Virginia Eastern District versus Missouri, you will, or used to be able to, find the critical security camera footage. Unless you're willing to deny physics and geometry, then we found that the track of the vehicle was at 90 degrees to the track of the airliner. The vehicle, by reference to the Pentagon, was approximately 20 feet by 18 inches. The US government replaced a key frame with a patch of smoke superimposed on a clean background. As noted, whatever you would like to believe, you will have to defeat basic geometry to challenge those claims. And precisely why was it so important to go to war on behalf of someone else's homeland, even if they were part of a powerful lobby in the USA? Cut to 2014, and in the middle of that war, and Kagan's husband, Victoria Nuland, was visiting Ukraine as an official to support a coup against the democratically elected pro-Russian government. She was also caught on tape selecting the new government of this liberal democracy, formerly considered the most corrupt nation in Europe. Imagine Russian or Chinese officials in Canada promoting a rebellion by Quebec to take down the Canadian government. Do you think the USA might have something to say about that? And so the war by the anti-Russian regime began against the ethnic Russians of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. That has included the consistent policy of shelling civilians, causing 14,000 deaths, a policy that continued throughout the past 2 years and has now been extended to Belgorod. Somehow the Ukrainian regime, short on shells and receiving Western munitions and missiles, considered it important to use those shells on civilians. That is not the behaviour of a military trying to win a war. It is a sideshow that panders to their hate of Russians. All such behaviour and the entire pre-2022 history of the Western Ukraine has been airbrushed out of the narrative. So I have a question. If your favourite football team went on a killing spree, would you support that? The leaders of the West went so far as to send Boris Johnson to cancel the peace agreement initialled by Ukraine. A West that has no interest in peace, which has agitated for and supported war since 2014, and yet which insists that Putin's actions were unprovoked. And those actions are to go into an immediate neighbour in support of ethnic Russians who requested yet again, "Get us out of here." And now they are indeed out of Ukraine and are a part of Russia. At which point I have to ask, why does the West insist that Ukraine must recover its conquered territory when the Ukrainian desire is solely to kill those in that territory? This isn't just a conflict, it is a determined agenda of malice, with flagrant misrepresentation of the facts by leaders in the West, a narrative fed to the populace that is disturbingly willing to accept whatever comes out of the spokespeople's and politicians' mouths as gospel. And when I look back at the escalation in the past 20 years, and the perversion of any possible decency or rationale for a just war, so that now it is just killing for convenience, a good investment according to Lindsey Graham, I say that is no longer simply geopolitics. This is the exploitation of a naive and indifferent population in our countries, the exploitation of the people of Ukraine, for no other purpose than to satisfy the greed of Western politicians and oligarchs to take down Russia and strip it, as they have done Ukraine. Listening to the blatant lies told on a daily basis, I can no longer see this as just geopolitics. We have allowed a very few people to so debase our nations that I can no longer see it as anything other than a manifestation of a sociopathic, narcissistic clique, one that to my mind has to be considered to be malign in the extreme, sufficient perhaps to border on pure evil. And then what happens but we revisit the Middle East, where the USA says there are no red lines and 30,000 civilian deaths are unfortunate, but what can you do? That ancestral homeland is a sovereign state. 500,000 deaths in Ukraine, 30,000 in Gaza in just a few weeks, 1 million in Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, did I miss any? And that's just the Middle East. Western leaders are now responsible for a death toll that is getting to the same order of magnitude, millions, as what is reasonably claimed to be one of the most abhorrent crimes in history. And it is being pushed by a clique that is supposed to be the victim of those crimes. So which is it? Were those crimes in the Second World War truly abhorrent, in which case this clique is of the same stamp, and even using the same ideology in Ukraine? Or were those World War II crimes now acceptable, because really the victims enjoy the same privilege now that they can do it to someone else? I say they are both abhorrent, and the clique has revealed its nature, and that nature is indistinguishable from pure evil. Human beings, regardless of their race, culture, or creed, do not deserve to be sent to their deaths in the tens or hundreds of thousands just to satisfy a group of smug, secure, wealthy Washington elite. If these conflicts are indeed existential for either the USA or its various ideological homelands, then let the clique don body armour and go and do the killing themselves. I find this 2 to 3 decades history to be abhorrent for what it says about the decline of the West from any position of decency and morality. Europe has twice invaded Russia, Napoleon and Adolf in Au2, and now has armed forces on Russia's border, courtesy of NATO expansion. Yet it is Europe that says Russia is a threat to Europe, and not the other way around. I say enough hypocrisy, enough fraud, enough lies. I believe it's time to take practical action to evolve beyond such an abhorrent regime in the West. That does not mean pointless political activism, it means living beyond the reach of the elite so that they are no longer funded by us, no longer supported by us, and their deeds are publicly known at last. That is entirely possible. I've already described that elsewhere, but will hopefully follow this up with appropriate videos to describe that process. For the moment, I just wanted to say enough. The elite have destroyed whatever was decent about the West. I believe that if we are to recover any such decency, we have to decide to do so, every one of us, and then we have to make it real. I'm Andrew Mather. You can reach me at andrewmatherexplore@gmail.com.